Greetings, everyone. Welcome back. In today's video, we'll dive into the bird's opening and explore how to play it effectively. Let's break down the bird's opening step by step. We start with pawn to f4. Before diving into the theory, let's understand why we play f4 in the first place. The main goal of this move is to control the e5 square. This idea of dominating f5 is central to the bird's opening and will remain a priority throughout the game. Our next two moves are almost always knight to f3 to strengthen control over e5, and bishop to b2 to add even more pressure. Later, since we have solid control over the e5 square, we'll position a knight on e5. This setup gives us a well-defended, centralized knight that can cause serious problems for black. Now, let's talk about black's possible responses. Against most setups, you'll have a consistent plan, except when black plays pawn to e5, known as the Fromm's Gambit. Objectively, it's not the strongest response, but it can be extremely dangerous if you're unprepared, leading to a quick checkmate. When black plays e5, you should accept the gambit. The danger comes from the now weakened diagonal, which black can exploit. Black's best follow-up is pawn to d6. You'll capture the pawn, and black will recapture, creating threats from both the queen and bishop. To handle this, immediately play knight to f3, blocking potential threats from black's queen. At this point, black has two main options to continue. If black responds with bishop to g4, attacking the knight, this isn't a serious threat. Simply play pawn to e3, bringing your queen into the defense of the knight. After a move like knight to c6, continue with bishop to e2. If black plays knight to f6, you can safely castle. Then, push pawn to b3 followed by bishop to b2. At this point, you're up a pawn, and even though your position might feel a bit cramped, black doesn't have much compensation for being a pawn down. This makes bishop to g4 a relatively weak option. However, a much stronger response is pawn to g5, known as the Lasker variation. This move may look odd, but the idea is to play pawn to g4, forcing your knight away and creating threats with the queen. To handle this, play pawn to g3 to block the diagonal and prevent immediate threats. Black will likely push pawn to g4, attacking your knight. In response, move your knight to the edge of the board at h4. In this case, black cannot effectively punish us, and they're still down a pawn. Once again, black has two main options in this mainline position. The first option is bishop to e7, immediately threatening our knight. We can't allow them to capture it because if we recapture, their queen would infiltrate our position, leading to a disastrous outcome. So, we need to retreat our knight to g2, which is exactly why we played pawn to g3 earlier. Now, black's best move is to push pawn to h5 and h4 to continue the attack. In response, simply play pawn to d4. This move opens up our bishop and prepares for defense. If black continues with h4, avoid capturing the pawn since that would allow black's bishop and queen to become active. Instead, play bishop to f4, reinforcing the pawn on h4 and solidifying your position. At this point, black runs out of steam and has no real compensation for being down a pawn. That's how you handle bishop to e7, but black's other main option in this mainline position is knight to e7, simply developing the knight. However, their kingside is completely exposed, making castling on that side impossible. The move you want to play here is pawn to d4, and there's a specific reason for this immediate push. After knight to g6, attempting to exchange knights, you'll capture the knight, and when black recaptures, a threat emerges. Black can capture your pawn since the rook is pinning it. To neutralize this threat, play queen to d3, which is precisely why we pushed d4 earlier. Now the pawn is safely defended. From here, continue with pawn to c3 and bishop to g2. You'll then reposition your knight to e4. Although black maintains some pressure from the pawn on g4 and the open h-file, they lack sufficient compensation for their weaknesses. I don't believe black has full compensation for the pawn, and you'll have strong chances in this position. That's how you handle pawn to e5, the Fromm's Gambit. So make sure you're familiar with this line. Now, let's dive into black's other responses. Here, black can choose from many options, including d5, c5, knight to f6, knight to c6, d6, or e6. The key takeaway is that no matter what black plays, except for pawn to e5, you can proceed in a very similar way. Let's use pawn to d5 as an example. Your first move should be knight to f3, controlling the e5 square while developing your knight. After black's reply, continue with pawn to b3. Notice how the ideas we discussed at the beginning are coming into play. You're consistently reinforcing control over e5. Finally, develop your bishop to b2, maintaining pressure on e5 and solidifying your position. This approach works effectively against most of black's options in the bird's opening, is that black's pawn break with e5 becomes very challenging to achieve, which is excellent for you. If black successfully plays e5, it could spell trouble for your position. More likely, black will continue developing with knight to fa6. You should then push pawn to e3, opening up the bishop with the intention of placing it on b5. The goal here is to trade off black's knight, reducing its influence on the e5 square and making it easier to control. At this stage, black has many options, but let's examine pawn to e6 as an example. Regardless of what black plays, your setup remains consistent. After e6 or any similar move, continue with bishop to b5. This pins the knight and aims to trade it off, reinforcing your grip on the a5 square. This consistent setup is reliable and can be used in nearly every line against black's responses in the bird's opening. If black provokes you with pawn to a6, this is actually a poor move because you were planning to capture the knight anyway. After the trade on c6, black ends up with doubled c-pawns, which are usually not beneficial in this position. While doubled pawns can be useful in some openings, this is not one of those cases. Simply castle, and you'll have a comfortable advantage. A better approach for black is to play bishop to d7, aiming to break the pin and recapture with the bishop once you eventually take on c6. And by the way, at some point you will capture that knight or another piece around this area. At this stage, simply castle. If black continues with bishop to e7, preparing to castle, you should play pawn to d3. The plan is to reposition your knight to d2 and later maneuver it to e5. From there, you can bring the other knight to f3, ensuring that both knights work together to dominate e5. Now, black will most likely castle, and you continue with knight to d2. At this point, black plays pawn to a6, provoking you to capture. Since we were planning to trade anyway, you go ahead and capture the knight. After black recaptures, you immediately place your knight in the center with knight to e5, attacking the bishop. The best defensive move for black would be bishop back to a8, but realistically, no human player would make such a passive move. Instead, the most common response is queen to c7, defending the bishop. At this stage, you have a few strong options. You can continue with knight d2 to f3, reinforcing your central knight and securing control over e5. You could also try queen to f3, positioning your queen for an attack. However, the most aggressive plan is to lift your rook with rook to f3. The idea is to maneuver the rook to g3 or h3, bringing your queen into the attack. This plan works well because black's pawn structure limits their pieces from properly defending the kingside. For example, if black retreats with knight to d7, a common move, you can immediately attack the knight, preparing pawn to f6, which will further strengthen your control over e5 and put pressure on black's position. Play rook to g3, and if black responds with pawn to f6, follow up with queen to g4. At this point, you're winning. Queen takes pawn on g7 is decisive, and black can't handle it. After rook to f7, knight captures, king captures, and queen captures on g7, you're completely winning. If black tries pawn to d4 to open up their bishop, play pawn to e4. Even though your bishop is blocked, black's pieces are also inactive. Their bishop and knight are staring at pawns, and your plan is to continue attacking on the king side. Move your rook to g3 or h3, bring your queen in, and your chances are excellent in this position. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you think this video is helpful, then like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.